So we are recording this, and we are also doing this for Facebook Live. So maybe we'll get some viewers from outside. Maybe people will just be scrolling in their Facebook tonight, and they'll suddenly see our faces and wonder what this is about, but that's okay. We invite those people to see this. Okay. So this is Santa Cruz. And I think it's working, but who knows? Excellent. Great. And if it's not working, then I'll know this for next time. So hopefully friends will tell me.
It's a new world, hey?
Right? It's like all this stuff that I have no idea what I'm at. Perfect. So tonight we're gonna have a presentation by Heidi Coombs, or Dr. Heidi Coombs. And she's gonna lead us through a Jane's Walk that she's been really graciously offering to me and been teaching me a lot about history stuff on Twitter in the past few months while I've been roaming around St. John's during COVID-19 and finding lots of interesting things. I was saying to many people, I don't view myself as somebody who is really interested in history, but during this time, stopping and actually making time and reading signage, I've realized the small little pieces that are connected in our city and the history that complements one area and another and how we've arrived to where we are today. So yeah, who knew I was this into history? But
well, your posts have been amazing, because I mean, I've been learning things from those signs too.
Really? Oh, that's really kind of you. Yeah, I've been just reading the signs on the Grand Concourse trails and everything have been really, really good. So for anybody that doesn't know who I am, my name is Megan Hullett, and I am the Vice Chair of Happy City St. John's. And chances are, if you're tuning into this, you probably know what or who Happy City St. John's is. But just for anybody that could be watching on Facebook right now that maybe isn't so familiar with us, I'll just let you know that Happy City St. John's is a volunteer board, and we're about 12 people, so we're a pretty big board. And we strive to make sure that we inform and encourage and facilitate public dialogue around civic issues in our city. And if you haven't heard of Jane's Walks before, or anytime earlier this month, typically they're the first weekend of May, and they are in honor of Jane Jacobs, and they happen all around the country. But given the special circumstances that we're living in right now, actually we've had them all month long. And it's been a really unique experience. Normally we have a lot packed into just that first weekend of May, and multiple walks, and they're all actual walks or runs or bike rides or whatever the case may be. But this year, with the physical distancing being a thing, we've had activities online posted for people to do with their families. We've had I Spy events, lots of different things. We've had people send us in PDFs that we can share. We've had creative writing sent in to share. Yeah, so we've had lots of really different, unique things. We still have plenty more to go, actually. This weekend on Saturday at 10 a.m. we'll have another Zoom meeting, and that's going to be with Dan Fickett. Information isn't on our website yet, happycitystjohns.ca, but it soon will be. And Dan is actually going to talk about the Grace Hospital neighborhood and how we could give that new life. We also have somebody talking on Friday about doing a boat tour, the boats in the harbor of St. John's. It's going to be really unique. We have lots of different activities, like I mentioned, the I Spy. If you do participate in any of these events, including today, if Heidi says something that's interesting that you're like, oh, I never knew about that, and you want to talk about it on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever, feel free to tag us with hashtag Jane'sWalkYYT. If you do that kind of thing, or if you participate in any of the activities, like I mentioned, the I Spy or basket making, or the May 2-4 camping event, you will be entered to win this cool little book, Tales from Afar. That was donated to us from St. John's Lip, that's the local immigration partnership. And it's a really beautiful little book. They are not for sale, so that makes them even more rare. It's a great little collection of stories from new residents. So I covered that. All these talks and walks and activities, you can catch all of that on all of our social media channels, and it all lives as well on our website if you want to find any of that. So Heidi's gonna speak to us today. We're going to leave the chat open, so in case anybody wants to ask any questions or make any comments along the way, Heidi is not necessarily gonna be watching that during her presentation, but I'll keep a track. And if you have any questions, I can certainly write them down, and then we can go through them at the end. We'll also open up the virtual floor at the end in case anybody wants to make a comment. I can certainly open up the microphones then, and people can make any kind of comments or questions or anything at all they want to offer. Let's see, what else? I guess that's it. I'll give you a little intro, Heidi. Well, we didn't know already about Heidi's cat. Now we're going to know about Heidi. Heidi is a historian and an education specialist that works with Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. She's also an independent filmmaker, and that's probably where I first saw Heidi, actually, which was pretty unique. She has a PhD in history, and she specializes in nursing with the Grenfell Mission in Northern Newfoundland and Labrador. She has produced many publications on this topic, and she is currently the president of the Newfoundland and Labrador Historical Society. So that's it. Take it away. Thank you so much, Heidi.
Oh, thank you for asking me. I'm really excited that people want to learn about this building, because I know all kinds of things about this building that people don't know, and it's nice that people are interested in it. It's got a really interesting history, and I know it's condominiums now, I think, and I would love to talk to somebody who actually lives there to know if there's like ghost stories and stuff, because yeah, it's a very interesting history. I guess I will start. I'll try to share my screen.
The green button down on the bottom.
Oh wait, no, it says host disabled participant screen.
Oh yes, you are right.
You need to be made co-host.
You're totally right. With all of my don't forget to press and don't forget to do this, I totally forgot that.
Okay, there we go. So I don't know if I don't think I can see chat while I'm sharing my screen.
That's okay.
Maybe I can. Okay. But I will focus on this. Can you all see that?
We can see your presentation just like you. Yep.
Okay. Okay. So I will just start in. The King George V Seamen's Institute at the east end of Water Street is, if you ask me, one of the most interesting buildings in the city, and certainly has been the center of many major events in our history, especially in the time period of 1912 to 1918. It was built in 1912 by the Royal National Mission to Deep Sea Fishermen with significant financial investment from the Grenfell Association of America in New York. And it really is a little piece of New York City in downtown St. John's. You'll probably notice it's quite different architecturally from other buildings in downtown St. John's. It's a very symmetrical neoclassical building of brick with limestone trim. And that was the trademark feature of the designers, renowned architects, William Adams Delano and Chester Aldrich. So, oh, this is where I need to change my screen. So this is the building today, captured on Google Street View, but I'm going to try to go to the internet. Let's see.
You're doing it great already.
Okay. Here we go. Okay, so this is Google Street View. That's the building whenever Google drove past in their car. That's what the building looked like. That's looking west. That building there, that's the old cable company building, the current Raymond's. And if you look this way, that's the War Memorial up there to the left. And down this way is Harvey's Wharf. And And that's going to be significant when I talk about the sealing disaster, which I'll get to in a little bit. But so just so you can get a sense of where this is on Water Street, it's like the East End right next to pretty much right next to Harborside Park and the War Memorial. And now I got to share my PowerPoint again. Let's see.
Green button. Perfect.
Oh, wait, no. That's the wrong thing. Okay. Can you see this, my slide there?
I can see the still of the building.
Okay, perfect. And now you can see this is an archival image. You can see that one, right?
Yeah, we can totally see it. Looks great.
Perfect. Okay, I did the transition. Yay.
That's excellent. Perfect transition. Not like we ever practiced it. We totally know what we're at.
Yes. So this is an image I stumbled upon today, actually, at the rooms. This is the site the site for the building was donated by Sir Edgar Bowering with an estimated value of, at the time, of $13,000. And this is a picture of the original site before the Institute was built there. These are the gentlemen who designed the building, Delano and Aldrich. They designed townhouses, country homes, and private clubs for elite clients in the United States, such as the Rockefellers, the Astors, and the Vanderbilts. They also designed banks and other public buildings and several buildings on the campuses of Yale and Cornell universities. Later, in the 1930s, they built the American Embassy in Paris and the new post office building in Washington, D.C. Many of their buildings have become major landmarks and historic sites in the United States. This is the new post office building in Washington, which is now the William Jefferson Clinton Federal Building. So that one was built in 1934, so it's past our period of the Siemens Institute, but very impressive that these gentlemen, the buildings that they were designing and building in the United States and around the world was pretty impressive. So closer to our time period of the Siemens Institute, which was built in 1912, you can see similarities in style between the King George V and these New York City buildings. Delano and Aldrich were the firm of choice for New York City clubhouses, private clubhouses, and their members' homes. They were very well networked into the elite of the American East Coast. Delano specifically was of the prominent Delano family of Massachusetts who made their fortune through banking and trading. The Colony Club, I believe, was a private women's club. The others were for men, and the Colony Club was exclusively for women. And they're in very posh areas of New York, Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue. So how did Delano and Aldrich, how did they become the designers of a building in downtown St. John's in 1912? Well, the connection, of course, was this man, Sir Wilfrid Grenfell. Grenfell established a branch of the British Royal National Mission to Deep Sea Fishermen in Newfoundland and Labrador in 1892. And by the early 20th century, it was called the Labrador, colloquially known as the Grenfell Mission or the Labrador branch, had become fairly independent of the main British organization, and Grenfell increasingly turned to the US and Canada to fund his expansion projects. He established fundraising branches throughout North America and began tapping into the mass philanthropy movement in the United States. One of the branches he established was particularly influential, and that was the Grenfell Association of America in New York. And William Adams Delano, our architect, sat on the board of the GAA. And the president of the GAA at the time was Henry Van Dyke. So Grenfell has successfully networked into this elite group of philanthropists in the United States, and they would hold significant influence over him for the rest of his life and over the International Grenfell Association, which the GAA was very instrumental in establishing in 1914. In 1908, Grenfell began agitating for a Seamen's Institute to be built in St. John's to accommodate fishermen and seamen whenever they had to stay overnight in the city. So for example, in March a lot of men from the outports came to St. John's to get a berth on a sealing vessel. And the only options for accommodation at the time were boarding houses. Grenfell felt that staying in boarding houses left these men susceptible to the temptations of nearby saloons. And according to the mission in the early 20th century, I love this, in the early 20th century, quote, "There was not a place in St. John's where one of these men can spend an hour of innocent recreation or sit down with a friend and be decent. The harbor was encircled by 57 saloons where warmth and companionship was extended to all strangers." So Grenfell did not approve of this warmth and companionship at the saloons. Building was highly promoted on both sides of the Atlantic. In fact, the mission arranged for King George V himself to lay the cornerstone for the building on the same day as his coronation. On June 22nd, 1911, at a predetermined time, the king pushed a button at Buckingham Palace that sent a telegraph signal to the site on Water Street that triggered a switch to lower the cornerstone into place. So from across the Atlantic, the king laid the cornerstone for the building named in his honor, which is a pretty impressive feat when you think about it in 1912. They must have been very determined to arrange with Buckingham Palace to get the king to push that button at a very specific time, on his coronation day too.
Wow.
Now, okay, so this is the slide I added in at the last minute because I felt I would be remiss if I didn't mention this man seated center. This is Charles Carnap, and he was the manager of the Seamen's Institute in its earliest days. He was very involved in fundraising and construction, and he got caught up in overall sloppy bookkeeping practices with the mission, and this caused a huge international scandal related to misappropriation of funds in 1912. And he was arrested and he went to jail here in St. John's, and it was all over the international press, and it was a huge scandal for the Grenfell mission. And the Grenfell mission of Grenfell Association of America, you'd see there's a lot of bankers and creditor, like a lot of moneyed philanthropists, wealthy elite accountants. Like that committee in particular had a lot of individuals associated with it who were kind of very fixated on money and finances and accounting. And this scandal happened because it was a transition period, and I got a paper written about this in a book on the history of the Grenfell mission. This was a transition period when the Grenfell mission started as a very it was centered on Wilfred Grenfell. It was a very small scale charity based on individual giving, and it's centered around this one individual and his charisma and his ability to raise money. And around 1910 to 1914, it transitioned into the International Grenfell Association, which was a very philanthropic organization with a lot of American influence. And the Americans had this idea of funding philanthropy in the way that they would a business. So they were very business astute with where they were providing their funds and fundraising and providing donations. So in the midst of all this, here's this young man. He was actually an American, and he became the superintendent of the building prior to and at the time of its opening. And he got caught up in this misappropriation of funds because previously Grenfell was not a very good bookkeeper. He was very good at raising money. He was not very good at keeping track of the ins and outs of the funds. So he would raise money and anybody could spend it in the mission if they thought it needed to be spent. There was no strict bookkeeping practices, no really rigorous accounting. And here's Charles Carnap, this young man, and he's put in charge of this organization, and he got caught up in this big time. I feel like he was, for lack of a better word, scapegoated, and it's unfortunate, but he was a very well-respected person prior to this, and I think, and you can see afterwards, it didn't seem to tarnish his reputation. And in fact, Clooney McPherson, was staunchly supportive of this man through the entire ordeal, and even into the 1940s and 50s, they had this friendship with Charles Carnap and his wife. So it was a big scandal. I won't go into any more detail than that, but suffice it to say, it was a big deal. It threatened the very existence of the Grenfell mission at this time, and everything Grenfell was trying to accomplish in Newfoundland and Labrador, because if people thought that money was being misappropriated, then they were not going to invest in the Grenfell mission as a cause, right? So I do have an article in a book called The Grenfell Medical Mission and American Support in Newfoundland and Labrador, 1890s to 1940s, if anyone is interested. It's a very interesting and sad story, actually. He did go to jail, and he had a young wife, a wife and young child here in who was born here in St. John's. But through all that, the Institute managed to open successfully. This is a photo of the December opening in Grenfell Hall, which is the main auditorium at the Siemens Institute. The opening was hosted by Governor Sir Ralph Williams in the center, and also in attendance were Marmaduke Winter, George Noling, Cluny McPherson, Gilbert Gosling, and John Harvey. These men, along with many others of the mercantile and professional elite of St. John's, were very involved in the Grenfell mission during this time and with the Institute in St. John's. And, oh, shoot. This is another picture of the building shortly after construction and its location at the east end of Water Street. You can see that the commercial cable building was not there yet. So the building that Raymond's restaurant is in, that was constructed in 1916. So that was 4 years after the Siemens Institute was built. And this is another image of the building. There was a girls' department on the top floor of the building to provide safe accommodations for women from the outports who were working in the city. I believe the entrance to the girls' department was here on the right-hand side. It was separate from the main entrance on the front, supposedly to keep the men away from the women in the building. These are some images from inside the building of the main entrance hall in both directions. You can see the main doors in the image on the left and the reception desk in the image on the right. And it looks like there's a fireplace directly across from the reception desk. I actually haven't been in this building recently, and I know it's been converted into condominiums, so I have no idea what it looks like inside right now. These are some more interior pictures. This is a bathroom, top left. The restaurant is bottom left, and this is a bedroom here on the right. I think these were promotional pictures that were included in the pamphlet to promote the Institute. The Institute also had a games room with billiard tables seen here, and these billiard tables took a bit of a beating during the First World War by a rowdy bunch of soldiers from the outports. And an officer's room with chessboards and a globe. Oops. And this was it was called a lend a hand reading room. The library, so this was a library, and the books for this library were donated by Andrew Carnegie. So you can really see how Grenfell was very connected to the elite of the East Coast of the United States at this time. And the building had a bowling alley, which was not common in St. John's, and it may have been one of the first bowling alleys in the city. I'm not sure about that. But the Institute contained a lot of amenities that were not common in the city. There was a gymnasium, an auditorium, which was called Grenfell Hall, an elevator, and a swimming pool. The swimming pool served two purposes. It encouraged bathing, and it also provided an opportunity for swimming lessons for the many fishermen who spent their lives on the sea but couldn't swim. The elevator, I don't have a picture of the elevator, but it was one of the first elevators in the city. I don't know if it was the first, but it was one of the first. And it had actually had a lot of several tragedies associated with it. So when I talk about hauntings in the Institute building, this is one of the things I wonder about. during construction, a worker fell to his death down the elevator shaft. And he left behind a wife and a young family. I believe the mission financially supported the family for several years afterwards. And during the Spanish flu, which I'll get to a bit later, an Australian man named Frederick Hillier fell down the elevator shaft to his death about 15 feet. In a cruel irony, he had just been discharged from the Institute, having recovered from the Spanish flu. He returned to the Institute complaining of pain in his side and was admitted for a few days for rest and observation. He was accompanying Dr. Fraser to the top floor of the building when he opened the elevator door and stepped forward, not realizing that the car had already risen up past his level, and he fell to the bottom. In the auditorium, the Institute offered educational lectures, concerts, and moving pictures by Mr. Kiley of the Nickel Theatre. This is a gathering of sealers at Grenfell Hall in March 1913, just prior to departing for the ice. And I don't have it captioned here, but I think this image is from the Yale archives at Yale University. And there's the program on the side of what would have been shown that night during that week while the sealers were in town. So this leads me to the first event of this period where the Institute stepped in to assist government and the public during a major crisis. And this would have been, of course, the sealing disaster of 1914. I'm sure everyone knows the story of the sealing disaster. On March 31st, 1914, 132 sealers from the SS Newfoundland were caught in a blizzard and stranded on the ice in the North Atlantic for 2 days and 2 nights. 77 men died on the ice over those 2 days, and another succumbed to his injuries after rescue. It was one of the worst disasters in Newfoundland and Labrador's sealing history. When reports of the disaster reached St. John's, the port physician, Dr. Alexander Campbell, was called to a meeting, a government meeting, and he was asked to assume control of management, quote, of the dead and living. So he arranged for the victims who were in serious condition to be sent to the general hospital with a physician to accompany anyone who was in danger of dying along the way. Any sealers who could walk were carried on stretchers and put in a temporary hospital on the top floor of the Seamen's Institute, where Dr. Clooney McPherson was put in charge with the St. John Ambulance Brigade. This is the SS Bonaventure returned with the sealers and docked at Harvey's Wharf next to the Institute. So the Institute was very well positioned to treat the survivors and to assist with the somber task of sorting and preparing the bodies of the deceased. In this way, it became at once the Institute became a temporary hospital and a temporary morgue in the service of the government. 15 survivors were brought to the Institute, carried by members of the brigade and naval reservists from HMS Calypso. Actually, my cat, who earlier was eating the plastic bag behind me, I called her Calypso after the HMS Calypso. In a cruel irony, just 4 weeks earlier, men from the Calypso had given concert parties to the sealers at the Institute before they left for the ice. And now here they were carrying dead and injured sealers back to the Institute for after their harrowing treatment for treatment or to go to the morgue. The survivors of this disaster truly suffered from trauma. They being stranded on the ice during a blizzard, fighting to stay alive, and witnessing so many of their friends and colleagues die was traumatizing. And Dr. McPherson described them as, quote, stunned by the calamity. Yet they were also relied upon to help identify the frozen bodies of their colleagues in the morgue. I've heard that some of the bodies were put in the swimming pool because they were frozen to thaw them out. They were put in the swimming pool. I haven't verified that yet, but I've heard it from a couple of sources. The morgue itself was horrifying. Added to the grief of relatives finding a loved one dead at the Institute was the distorted state of some of the bodies. So if a man died lying forward on the ice, I should say a man or a boy, because boys went to the ice too. If a man or boy died lying forward on the ice, his face would be misshapen, swollen, and discolored from frostburn. At the sealing inquiry, Dr. McPherson painted a grim picture of the morgue and the grief experienced by families. He said, quote, "I was in and out of the mortuary room a good deal because I had a detachment on duty there all the time that they were there practically, at least all the time that relatives were there because of the number of cases of hysteria and one thing and another. So I had a detachment there all the time." So the morgue was in the Grenfell Institute, and McPherson had to have a detachment there because it was so painful for the families to see their loved ones there. And this quote from McPherson really captures his perspective of the disaster. Quote, "The men who go out to the ice are all of pretty fair physique. They were all a splendid body of men, and it was a terrible thing to see such hardy-looking, healthy men in a heap dead." It's pretty telling for the experience. This is an image from the rooms of the members of the St. John's divisions of the St. John Ambulance Brigade who helped transfer survivors to the Institute, and they cared for them at the temporary hospital. Clooney McPherson is center, and I have a list of everyone else in the photograph if anybody else is interested. Okay. So the country was just recovering from the sealing disaster when the First World War began in August 1914. That was a very heavy year. We think 2020 is bad, and it is bad. But 1914 had the sealing disaster and then the First World War. I won't go into too much detail about the war period because I'd like to get to the Spanish flu history, but just very quickly, during the war, the Institute provided accommodations for recruits from the outports while they were in St. John's, either waiting for transfer to camp or barracks, or upon returning from overseas. The Institute was the largest building of its kind in St. John's at the time, and the best option for accommodating the flood of recruits to the city was the Institute. It also became known as a headquarters for soldiers during, quote, their idle hours. And in June 1916, the Women's Patriotic Association officially opened the Soldiers and Sailors Club at the Institute. The club was located in two sections of the building, Grenfell Hall and the gymnasium. It was intended as a gathering place open to all members of the regiment or the Naval Reserve, regardless of whether or not they were boarding at the Institute. And they provided games, local and foreign newspapers and magazines, a writing room with desks and pens and ink and paper, and refreshments and entertainments. Notably, they had concerts by the Church Lads Brigade and the Catholic Cadet Corps. The building was put to full use during the war, and the government had to compensate the Grenfell Mission on several occasions because of damages. It was increasingly full of rowdy soldiers arriving from the outports, going through training or returning from war, men that people with the Grenfell Mission described as having, quote, little, if any, discipline. Apparently they beat up the billiards tables to a certain degree that they had to be refinished several times during the course of the war. The Institute was a very active place in August 1918, and the city was preparing for the arrival of 1,800 conscripts in October as part of the Military Service Act, or conscription, when reports began circulating at the end of September of the arrival of the Spanish flu. By October 10th, it was clear that gathering so many men in the city during a potential influenza epidemic with limited hospital accommodations available could have serious and fatal consequences. So the draft was postponed by a month, and by which time the war was over. In the meantime, the first cases of the flu, or the first reported cases of the flu, arrived in St. John's on September 30th, when 3 sick seamen arrived by steamer and were transferred to the Fever Hospital. The Fever Hospital was at the foot of Signal Hill. On October 2nd, 14 more cases arrived on 2 separate ships, and 2 of those cases were also sent to hospital. And more cases continued to arrive by ship throughout the fall. So the port of St. John's was really somewhat of an Achilles heel for the city in terms of exposure to the flu. A lot of people carrying the flu came in through the harbor. By October 7th, the local health authorities had recognized that based on what was happening in the Canadian cities, an outbreak of influenza in Newfoundland and Labrador was imminent, and they met to discuss their options. The public health officer published recommendations on preventing the spread of influenza, specifically highlighting factories, which I found interesting, suggesting that foremen watch for signs of the flu in their employees, so working class employees, including chills, headache, aches and pains, sneezing, sore throat, fatigue, and fever. Any such employees were to be isolated as much as possible. People were also to be warned of the dangers of spitting, sneezing, and coughing without using a handkerchief. These instructions were also applicable to schools and all places of employment. Meanwhile, cases of infection steadily increased, and local newspapers subsequently began publishing reports of new cases and deaths related to influenza on a regular basis. On October 14th, in an attempt to limit the spread of influenza, Dr. Fraser closed all places of public gathering, including schools, theaters, moving pictures, and concert halls, and other places where people gathered. So it was approximately 2 weeks after the first reported cases in the city before these measures were put into place, which is really different from how we've experienced the epidemic or the pandemic, currently the COVID-19. Health officials have been pretty proactive here compared to what we went through in 1918. And Dr. Fraser also provided these instructions to magistrates outside the city. It's interesting to see these instructions. They're similar in many ways to measures we are taking today to prevent the spread of the virus. There was very little that could be done for anyone who became sick beyond rest and a healthy diet. It's also interesting to see at the bottom here, Dr. Fraser says that quarantine is difficult to establish with any degree of success, and the presence of police to enforce quarantine could create more panic. By mid-October, the Grenfell, or the General Hospital and the Fever Hospital were both operating at full capacity. The city was also dealing with a serious outbreak of diphtheria, as well as cases of smallpox and scarlet fever and typhoid. And new cases of influenza were being reported every day. So to alleviate the pressure on the General and Fever hospitals, on October 15th, the government arranged with the International Grenfell Association to turn the King George V Institute into an emergency hospital for Spanish flu. Within 24 hours, the Institute had already admitted 22 patients, and 2 days later, it had 32 patients with a staff of 6 trained and volunteer nurses. From this point on, the Institute, in its capacity as an emergency hospital, was often referred to as Grenfell Hall Hospital. And I suspect that's because the first ward of 24 beds was actually based in the auditorium, which was called Grenfell Hall. The hospital at first had 3 wards, one for men consisting of 24 beds, which was Grenfell Hall, another for men consisting of 12 beds, and one for women consisting of 8 beds. By October 24th, there was also a convalescent ward, and the billiard and reading rooms and the restaurant were all converted into wards. The cases prioritized at the hospital were seamen first, and then people from the city, especially the most destitute. Through the course of 9 weeks, from October 15th to December 7th, 267 patients were admitted to the Institute, including 47 men and 59 women and children from the city. So these would have been primarily the destitute of the city. 41 women from the outports who were working in St. John's as domestic servants at the time, and 120 fishermen and seamen from the outports and various countries, including England, Scotland, the United States, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Holland, Norway, Russia, the Baltics, Australia, Somaliland, which is a region of Somalia, and the West Indies. So this really highlights how international a port St. John's was at the time. In keeping with the mission's non-denominational policy, Jewish, Lutheran, Greek Orthodox, Baptist, and Muslim patients were all treated at the Institute. So nobody was turned away based on their country of origin or their religious or ethnic background. This graph shows the inpatients at the hospital, and you can see the number of patients peaked on November 1st. And by December 9th, the worst of the epidemic had passed, and all future cases of influenza were sent to the fever hospital. 31 people died of influenza at this hospital during the period. The Institute afterwards had to be fumigated and prepared by December 15th to receive soldiers returning from overseas. So after its brief tenure as an emergency hospital, the Institute had to quickly switch gears again to focus on accommodating soldiers and sailors who needed accommodations in the city. This is an image from the Newfoundland Quarterly of some of the staff at the Institute during the Spanish flu. There are 2 trained nurses and several VADs here, or volunteer aid detachment nurses. And Walter Jones, who was the superintendent of the Institute with the Grenfell mission, is in the back center with his wife next to him. By all reports, dealing with the Spanish flu was a terrible strain on everyone, especially the nurses and the VADs. Several of them became sick, including Mary Mealy and Lois Reed. And I believe at one point, Mrs. Jones herself became ill, but she did recover. After the entire ordeal, Walter Jones wrote to the government about his experience. He thanked them for the confidence they placed in him during the ordeal. And he said, quote, "It has been a sad pleasure, the hardest time of my life. And although I am tired and run down, it is in the work of it. It is in the work and not of it." There was also one VAD at the Institute who contracted the flu while she was treating patients there, and she very tragically died from the disease. And that was Ethel Dickinson. Ethel Dickinson was the daughter of Gustavus Dickinson and Selina Pitts, one of the wealthy Pitts families of St. John's. She was a school teacher, and she studied domestic science at the MacDonald Institute in Guelph, Ontario, and she taught domestic science in St. John's. During the war, she served with the Volunteer Aid Detachment overseas, but her health deteriorated during the summer of 1918, and she returned home to rest. She began teaching again in September, but when the call went out for volunteers to help care for patients of the Spanish flu, she put herself forth and offered to help. She was volunteering at the Institute when she contracted the virus herself on October 24th, and she died 2 days later. Ethel Dickinson was well known and beloved in St. John's. Her obituary in the Evening Telegram stated, quote, "The number of friends of the deceased lady is legion. She was very popular and in all circles took a prominent." Actually, Linda White has an excellent article on Ethel Dickinson in the Newfoundland Quarterly. If anyone wants more information about her, it's in the fall issue of 2018, the fall 2018 issue. And this is the monument to Ethel Dickinson at Cavendish Square that was erected in 1920. This is a photo by Melissa Royal Pritch that I found on Twitter, so I hope she doesn't mind me using it. I really like the angle that she took of the monument. Okay, so I'm going to exit out of my slideshow. That's it for my slideshow right now.
Perfect.
I'm going to exit out and try to share. Okay. Share something else. I was going to share a Google Street View, but I think it's gone. Google Street View of Cavendish Square.
You just tell me, Heidi, if you need my help with anything.
Okay. Can you see? Okay, my screen is paused, hey?
Yeah, we can still see the Ethel Dickinson statue.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll type in 93 Water Street.
That is a great angle. I took a picture of this monument the other day that I learned about it, I guess like a few months ago. And it was hard to get a good picture, so that's
like it's true. And I've seen a couple of regular pictures of it, trying to capture the whole thing in an image, but that angle like really captured it for me. Okay, so 93 Water Street, let's see. Okay. I will share my screen again. Google Maps.
Yeah.
Okay, can you see that?
We can, yeah.
Okay, we're back to the King George V Institute. Okay, so if we go further east, if we were walking, we'd get all kinds of exercise now, right? It's terrible. I'm not getting any exercise right now.
After this, Heidi, when it's done.
Yes. Now, okay, so keep going further east and we'll go up by, okay, the Four Sisters. And I don't know if anybody lives in these buildings, but they're amazing. I don't think anyone lives there, but they're amazing. And I heard that they're haunted.
Yeah, I think that's a common story. I know I've seen other people talk about them online in recent times, about
Yeah.
people that own them.
Okay, I gotta head back towards the hotel. Here we go. I went past it. Okay. Oh my gosh. Now where am I to?
You're so close to it.
I know I'm like walking all around. Okay, here we go. So this monument, it was erected in there it is, in 1920, and it's kind of hidden because, well, I mean, like there's a Dodge Ram right in front of it. Like, honestly. So, but it looks like there's pretty lilacs there, but it's totally hidden. But anyway, this is the monument to Ethel Dickinson, who she was one of two Newfoundland nurses who died of influenza during the 1918 epidemic. Bertha Bartlett actually died as well. She was but you don't hear as much about her because she was in the UK at the time. She was in London, and I think she's buried at Wandsworth. But Bertha Bartlett from Brigus was another VAD who died of influenza. But yeah, this is the Ethel Dickinson monument, which is just a little bit further east from the institute where she unfortunately died. But yeah, she was beloved. Everybody, people spoke so highly of her, and it's such a tragic outcome that she volunteered to help other people who were sick, and then she contracted it herself, and then she died.
And fairly quickly, like you said, Heidi, just 2 days.
Yep, yep. And it could happen as quickly as that. Like, and even I was reading, she seemed like she was okay for a little while, like she was sick, but she was okay, and then within the matter of hours, she was gone. I don't know. I guess the virus it just took over, and that was it. She couldn't rally. So that's pretty much it for my my walk from my family room, my comfy family room chair.
Yeah, Tyler had a question. I'm just trying to also unmute all of you, but Tyler had a question about if you know the current status of the building regarding heritage designation, if it's municipally or provincially designated, I wonder. And I'm also just unmuting everybody in case anybody wants to chime in at this point.
That's a good question. I think it does have heritage status. The Heritage Foundation, which must be, maybe it's provincial.
Okay.
I think it does have heritage status. I'm not sure at what level, but I believe it does have a designation by the Heritage Foundation, but I could be wrong about that, but it should. And it's actually not the only Delano and Aldrich building that was built in Newfoundland. There were other Grenfell Mission buildings that they designed up in St. Anthony. And I believe one of the buildings by the Basilica, the Bishop's Palace, was designed by Delano and Aldrich. So
Wow.
they had a particular style too.
And do you know what in St. Anthony would have been designed by them?
I believe the old hospital and maybe the nurses' residence. I think there's an article in the book. So the book that I have that I wrote about Charles Curnock, I'm a little bit partial to Charles Curnock because I think he was hard done by with the Grenfell Mission.
Yeah.
It's in this book.
Okay.
the Grenfell Medical Mission and American Support in Newfoundland and Labrador. So there's another article in here about by Rafika Ruiz about Edgar McNeil and the St. Anthony Hospital. So that was built, I think that was opened in 1927. So I think the old St. Anthony Hospital was designed by them, and also the nurses' residence. And I've also heard that St. Clair's Hospital here in St. John's was designed by them. I haven't confirmed it, but that's what I've heard.
Cool.
Yep.
Wow, that's like, and I was totally wondering about the, like, is there a pool there? Is there, I heard somebody say, but you know, sometimes you hear these stories and you're not really sure like what actually is true or whatever the case may be.
I don't feel bad yourself.
Yeah.
Hearing that today, like when you mentioned that, I was like, okay, that isn't like a old wives' tale or whatever.
Yeah, and I don't, like, I haven't been, I'd love for somebody to invite me in the building. I think it's condos now, so there's restrictions, but I know there was a swimming pool, and part of the reason they put a swimming pool there was because so many fishermen couldn't swim, and they would drown. So they thought that swimming lessons would be a really good use of their idle hours. But I also heard that some of the victims of the ceiling disaster were thawed out in the swimming pool. So I've heard some of those things, and I haven't been able to confirm them, but according to the early records, there would have been a swimming pool in the building, and a bowling alley, and the elevator.
Yeah.
So those things would have been really unique in St. John's at the time.
I can only imagine all the like haunted, scary stories with all just the little bit of history that you shared there. Like, wow.
The elevator is really creepy because, yeah, just stepping out and falling down the elevator shaft. Yeah,
Wow.
what a horrible, horrible way to go.
I have to say, I also wondered, and maybe it's super materialistic of me, but those billiards tables that you mentioned, I'm like, where did they end up? Who knows where I wonder if they're still there. Like, this is on Facebook Live. In case you know somebody that knows somebody that lives in that building right now, we really want to go inside.
Yeah. Oh my God, I'd love to get in there. But I think I don't know what happened to the billiard table. It was so funny reading about how they were talking about the soldiers and how rowdy they were, and they were novices at the game, and they were beating up the billiards tables. But you can imagine, like, so this would have been during the First World War, and a lot of young men from the outports coming into the city, probably their first time in the city, and they were training to go to war, which, you know, the anxiety level of that alone, right? So here were these young men in the city on their own for probably the first time, and there were these entertainments. So it's interesting to hear the different perspectives, and how the Grenfell was very concerned about, you know, wholesome activities. And I mean, wholesome activities before, when you're about to be shipped overseas to go to the front lines in France, you're not thinking about wholesome activities.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, but so the different perspectives of how people, and there was a class thing too, like they might not have been any more novice than anybody else with the billiards tables, but the fact that they were outport kids from in Newfoundland, fishermen and workers, they got labeled as rowdy and hard cases.
One of the other participants also mentioned, like, in case anybody with the Historic Trust is listening or watching right now, it could be interesting, even if we could just get in the front lobby, because your pictures were awesome with the lobby, with the fireplace and everything. Just to see that, maybe for their doors open in the future. I believe that happens in the fall if things are different.
That's a great
physical
idea.
distancing in that point. At least this recording also lives on, so they can see that, like, we're interested.
Yeah. I'm actually interested in doing more research about the building in later years, because I think at a certain point the Grenfell Mission gave up the building, I think, to the YMCA. And so it was used by the YMCA for a number of years. And Then during the Second World War, I think it became the Caribou Hut, which was another place of gathering for soldiers and sailors. So this is just like one snapshot of this building, but there's so much more to the story than, now this is a huge part of the story. I mean, being involved in, so intimately involved in the sealing disaster, and then the First World War, and then the Spanish flu. And that was within a 4-year time frame, or 5 or 6-year time frame. That was huge, right?
That is a lot.
Yeah. And it was interesting because the building kind of had a negative public image for a while because of this scandal with Charles Carnap. And that scandal actually created a huge divide within the Grenfell mission. And as far as I know, Clooney McPherson, who is revered here in Newfoundland, and Wilfred Grenfell, who is also revered. I've given public presentations where people think I'm criticizing Grenfell, and they've gotten very angry at me. So these two men are revered in Newfoundland, but because of this Charles Carnap incident, they were on the outs for years. Like I don't think they were close, like, because Clooney McPherson volunteered with the mission back in like 1902, 1903. But this caused such a divide within the mission because Clooney McPherson felt that Grenfell was scapegoating this poor young man. And Grenfell was getting a lot of guidance from the American accountants who were saying, you know, you got to nip this in the bud, and yeah, this may have happened, but it can't happen again, and you got to be seen to be firm here. And that's what they did. This poor guy, oh my God, he went to Her Majesty's Penitentiary here in St. John's for 6 months.
And you said he had a daughter, he had family. Now I guess, of course, they would have passed on by now, but.
Yeah. But apparently their lives afterwards were okay. Like his wife was really good friends with Phoebe Florence Miller, and they kept up a correspondence for many years. And she said, you know, what happened in 1912, it didn't tarnish our family, thank God. They were able to get over it, right? But I think part of that might have been because it was a pretty shitty thing that happened to him. And yeah, he was scapegoated.
Right. Well,
All very
thanks a
interesting.
million. This is like more than I ever thought. Like, how many times have I walked by that building? And honestly, it sticks out to me as like different in terms of its color and everything. Again, can you tell I have zero historical eye here, guys? But I never really, I definitely didn't know who designed it and the global connections that that building had. And like, if you talk these days about buildings downtown having pools or bowling alleys or all these kinds of things, like, yeah, that is really wild and interesting how it flipped from, you know, a building that really helped to service people that were going out to sea to, you know, hospital to condos right now, like really different.
Yeah. I'd like to do more research on the girls department.
Yeah.
During the Spanish flu, Walter Jones was given, I think he was given a $900 honorarium for all the work that he did during that period. And the matron of the girls department, I think, got something like $120 or something. It was much less. But the problem with a lot of times the problem with historical research is the records. Like there might not be a whole lot there that you can dig into.
Right.
But the girls department its purpose was to protect the daughters of fishermen who were in the city looking for work and stuff. So
right.
To preserve their integrity and give them a safe place to live, right?
And the mothers, like, did they go there too, or is it just for the children, or?
Well, it would have been for single women who were looking for work and working in the city, but
Right.
they were pitched and described as the daughters of fishermen. So, yeah, there was this paternalistic angle. Yeah,
Right.
they were not considered single young women being proactive and trying to find a job. They were the daughters of Fisher.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested to hear more, like, and how you decide, how you sort of mentioned that, you know, it was a separate entrance. Like, this
Yeah,
building has really had a lot of different uses.
it has. Yeah, yeah.
Wow, really interesting. Thanks a million.
Thank you. I love this. I think there needs to be a plaque out front of the building, like describing a little bit more of the details of the history.
Yeah,
You know, walking past the building, you would never know that this was like ground zero for the Spanish flu, or that it was so intimately involved in the ceiling disaster. You just walk past it and think, oh, it's a brick building in St. John's.
right, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
brilliant. In all of my history readings of signage randomly around St. John's, I have not yet come across one that mentions this building like this. Some of the names, but
Yeah. We got to create a new sign.
if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to type them in or mention them now. Other than that, I'm just going to remind.
I think there's a sign actually that's down around the Harborside Park, isn't there? With a little bit of that history in it. But I could be
Oh,
wrong.
at Harborside Park?
Yeah, I thought there was, but it's been a while since I've been down that way.
It
I
could
know I
be.
remember, seeing it somewhere.
Yeah.
It
Yeah, because
definitely could
Harborside Park is the area where Harvey's Wharf used to be too, and the Ocean Expo still come in there.
Hmm. I just got a quick question, actually. What was it? I'm always interested in how the city rebuilt after 1892, the fire. And this building started in 1911. Was it vacant all that time? Or there was something else there in between?
There was something else there, and I'm not sure exactly what it was, but it was property owned by Bain Johnson, and he donated that land to the Grenfell Mission to build the Institute in 1911, 1912. So one of the slides, I found that picture today online through the rooms. There is a picture of the site before the Institute was built there. And I can't really tell because it looks like there was a smaller building there and like maybe a warehouse. So I'm not sure exactly what was there before the Institute went up.
Because I think
But
all that land on that south side of Water Street would have been mercantile, the fishing premises, and very highly sought after as just frontage space on the water,
yeah,
and things. So
yeah, for
a
sure.
very valuable place to put that building.
Yep. So yeah, Edgar Baring it was who donated the land. And he was involved in the building committee of I believe he was involved in the building committee of the Institute. And but at this period, a lot of the merchants in St. John's were very supportive of Grenfell because they recognized that what he was doing would benefit them as well. Because if he's helping the fishermen stay healthy, then that helps the merchants with their seasonal supply, right? But at a certain point, it was not. There were frictions between Grenfell and the merchant community over the years, but at this time, they were kind of mutually supportive of each other. So I'm pretty sure that Edgar Bowring donated this land, which was prime real estate at the time. But now this slide that I found at the room says that it was purchased at $13,000. But I read that it was donated and it was valued at $13,000. So yeah, it definitely would have been prime real estate, and it was right next to Harvey's Wharf. So it would be interesting to be involved in the conversations that took place about that, in terms of Grenfell approaching the merchants of the city and saying, this is what I want to do here. We need accommodations for fishermen and sealers coming into St. John's, and Edgar Bowring offering up this prime real estate for the building. It'd be neat to be a fly on the wall to hear what that conversation went like.
It did seem to be an era when there were wealthy philanthropists around willing to put their names on buildings and things.
Yeah,
So
definitely. Yeah, for sure.
So if nobody else has any other questions, we'll end it there. I'll just remind people that, I'm sorry, I have a bit of a interesting cast. This is not a filter on my phone right now, guys. um, we do have some more walks, like I mentioned, and activities coming up this week. Like I said, on Friday, we'll have a walk with the boats that are in the harbor. A walk with the boats. Yeah, I did say that.
A walk with the boats.
Peter's going to be going through different boats that are in the harbor right now, what they're used for. And then on Saturday morning at 10 a.m. it'll be Zoom again. You can get all the details on our website, happycity.ca, with Dan Ficken talking about the Grace Hospital neighborhood and how we could re-envision that. Don't forget to use the hashtag JamesWalkYYT for a chance to get this awesome book. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you. This was lovely. I loved it.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.